All right, third video, researching the docket. So in the last one, we just talked about what a docket is, what legislation is, bills, resolutions, constitutional amendments, all that good stuff. After the tournament has released the docket, you're going to need to do something with it. And that's what we're talking about now. Researching legislation. So we're going to go over approaches to docket research, how to create a research document online or one that is padded, so like on an actual legal pad. How to create, deciding whether to group prep or share research, bias existing within media, and then best practices for researching. So just an example, the Nationals docket is, if not the largest, then definitely like in the top 5 dockets that exist in the States in any given season. It is quite the handful and can be really overwhelming, but is also the goal for a lot of people. And it's a very feasible one. Most tournament dockets will be a fraction of this size, usually like 10 to 15 pieces of legislation. Once you get into the national circuit, then those ones get larger because you have more rounds to cover. So you're going to have preliminary legislation, semifinal or quarterfinal, and then as the rounds advance, they keep going. The largest tournament that I am aware of has octafinals. So you have, and that one actually also has a morning hour. So morning hour, preliminary, octafinals, quarterfinals, semifinals, finals, and all the legislation is earmarked for where on the agenda or where throughout the sessions it's going to appear. So legislation earmarked for prelims can only be proposed and debated in prelims. Same goes for all the other sessions. Yeah, that's all I really have to say about that. When you get a docket, there are 2 main approaches to do researching it. You can either do bottom up or top down. Pros and cons to both. Bottom up is you start at the first piece of legislation, so like P1, preliminary 1, and just continue prepping sequentially. You go through it. When you're making a research doc and reading through something for the first time, really, really good idea to just write down a couple of ideas that come to mind when you first read through it. Take notes whenever you're going through research. You really should be not wasting any time that you have assigned to looking at research. So that's what you should be doing. Pros to having bottom up is that you're going to have fully fleshed preliminary speeches. So those constructive speeches given in the first few cycles, that's helpful. You're also going to have a really good understanding of everything within debate because you should have researched both sides of it, or at least fully fleshed one and have a fundamental understanding of the other. Cons is that you're less prepared for out rounds. So in the case that those preliminary speeches really are as good as you put your time into them, then when you get to those out rounds, you may be less prepared. So be aware of that. If you do top down research, then you start at the last piece of legislation, last one in finals, or as far as you plan to break. So say it's my first time going to nationals and I really don't think I'm going to get to finals, but maybe I'll get to quarterfinals. I would start in the quarterfinals legislation, last one, and just keep going backwards from there. So I think it's like, let me not give you fake information. So E8, that's quarterfinals 8. I would just start there and then go E7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and then go into like P15, 14, 13, 12. And you just go backwards. The pros of this is that you're going to have strong out cycle speeches. The cons is that those preliminary speeches may need to be a little bit more extemporaneous, which works for a lot of people, especially if you have more experience on the circuit, especially if you are stronger with reputation. And just something to note is that a lot of people in those out rounds don't have first cycle constructives ready, especially sponsorships. So they might not be prepared to give that first affirmative. And that's a place that you can snag for really good recency. Because if you give a first affirmative on one of the first pieces or the first piece of legislation on an agenda, you have the lowest recency going into the next bill, assuming that everyone speaks once. So you really get to choose if you want to do another constructive, if you want to do a refutation, if you want to do a crystal. Other people who are less prepared and aren't able to speak in the first few cycles are really trapped then, because they gave like a cycle 4, 5, 6, 7 speech, and it's very difficult to jump in recency on the next one unless no one has given or no one is prepared for that first affirmative and you jump into there. So just be aware, a little bit of a strategy there, right? There is a whole slide on this. Too often, speakers rely on the other members to establish the constructive contention so that they can extend and refute in later cycles. It is in the best interest of debaters aiming to get to these out rounds to have points on both sides and the ability to speak extemporaneously. There's going to be a whole video on that later. Extemporaneous speaking pretty much just means you speak without knowing what you're going to say in any given second before you say it. A lot of times, people will start with building constructive speeches and then having a couple constructive points and doing refutation, and that refutation is mainly extemporaneous, and then outline a speech and just speak from an outline, and then go up and wing it. And that winging it is extemporaneous speaking. Arguably, extemporaneous is also speaking from an outline. It just takes a little bit of a different meaning if you have competed in extemporaneous speaking, the category in NSDA, because then you don't get an outline. Then you're just kind of crossing your fingers and hoping you remember your sources. Research docs. Okay, so when you get that document of all of the legislation, so that original docket, it's a really good idea to have the same process for how you're going to approach the docket for any given tournament. This changes a little bit based off of how many people you're going to have the ability to research with. So say that you're working by yourself, you don't have a team, you're probably going to have the same approach to every single docket. If instead you are working on a small team and have a couple different people that you can rely on to break up the research, then you're going to want to split it. I would not split it with one person does semis, one does quarters, one does prelims. Usually you want to do, like, if you're splitting between 3, okay, number 1, 4, 7 is going to be person number 1. Number 2, 5, 8, person number 2. Number 3, 6, 9, person number 3. And that way you have a little bit more variety of what it is that you are researching, and you all are familiar with at least a few of the bills in every session. That in mind, whenever you do research docs, you should be reviewing all of the information that has been researched by all members on the research team. So have a Zoom call, meet in person, go get coffee, whatever it is, and make sure that everyone is aware of the information and arguments that have been presented and written out. On any given research doc, you should have a screenshot of the legislation, a background section with all information and relevant research, especially with those links to where you got that research from so that people can do more reading on the background, an affirmation section, a negation section, and something at the bottom for blocks and questions for the opposing side. I always recommend to people that they have 5 different points on both sides that you can pick from throughout the round and tailor your speech to what you need. So if you come up with 5 points on the affirmation to pass a bill, and they all have claim, warrant, data, impact, so a tag and how it connects to the legislation and data to back it up and the impact / scope of it, then that puts you in a lot stronger position to, if someone takes a point that you were going to do and you no longer have the ability to, well, you have a couple spares to use. If someone makes a point on the opposite side that you can refute really well with something that you've established, well, then you already have a contention built up. Having 5 points on both sides gives you a lot of flexibility in round to jump around where you need to. And once you learn to speak extemporaneously or speak from an outline, it gets a lot easier just to come up with stuff in round, to research in round. Here, I have an empty research document and a filled research document. I think if I click them, it'll work to show you things. Hopefully. This empty research document is really just an outline for what you should be filling in whenever you have a piece of legislation. It'll be in the description of the video, available for your use as well. Please copy it. I don't think you can edit this, but just copy it. Up here is where the screenshot of the legislation would go. Purpose of the legislation is like the intention, what issue they're trying to solve. Background is any relevant background information. And then you have the 2 sides with the 5 parts. So affirmation, negation, AGD, background, thesis. We'll go through that a little bit later when we're constructing speeches. And then all of those points, tags, this whole tag here thing is just like 1-2 words to sum up what your contention is arguing. And then this is where the body of your contention goes, including claim, warrant, data, impact, which we're also going through in the next video, how to write speeches. But that's the document that you should be using. Here's an example of a filled one. I'm going to note this is a mess, which is because it was put together by, I think this one was just a team of 2, in a bit of a scramble, because for this particular tournament, we were doing top-down prepping, and this is prelims number 2. So I think this might have been written the night before. This is the legislation with a full screenshot of it so that you're able to read everything in all parts. This is the gist of the legislation. So that's like on the other one, the intention. This is AGD, and then background was just memorized and delivered. Because I was only working with one other person, we were doing all this over FaceTime and we're just talking about everything the night before. So I knew I would remember it going into the next day. With affirmation and negation, these are just the possible points that we were talking about could be delivered, and they're on separate sections. We did have the same stock AGD for both of these. Sometimes you want to curtail the AGD for whatever it is that you're going to be talking about within the content of the speech. We didn't deem it necessary for this particular one, so we didn't. And that, of course, is up to your discretion. It's your research document. Make it in a way that is going to help you. All right, and this should be full screen. Perfect. All right, and again, links to both of those will be made available down below. This is an example of padded research. So when you have a research doc that you're sharing online, it's really, really helpful to be able to have exactly what it is you're going to say on a piece of paper. This is literally that. When I was competing in person, I was using mini legal pads because they're the perfect size to be able to put one case on. There's enough spot for like AGD, introduction, background, thesis, and then you have your points. Points were on this one, human genome, government database, and LawSec. This was the same piece of legislation that you saw on the last one, just taking the negation case and putting it into something. I don't have the original that I was speaking off of. This is just one that was recreated, but it does the same function as the last one. The background section is irrelevant again in this case because it was mainly memorized. Affirmation and negation, this is just the negation side. And then blocks and cues for opposing side, again, those were memorized, but when you want them written out, you just put them in that space at the bottom, and anything that you really want to ask or you think will be a clincher or establish a point for you would be good. So an example for this one, in this case, the legislation was talking about deleting, actually I have this, so Post-its. I just put the legislation, the gist of it onto a Post-it so that it doesn't take up any space on the page. But it's just going over the section, like section 1, specific consent, section 2, genetic code definition, organization definition, section 3, LawSec tasked, 18 million allocated from NIH, HHS. So just like a summary of what's going on in shorthand. There's also a bit of shorthand on here. This is more fleshed than I would typically make an outline. Usually an outline has like 5-10 words in each section, but it's difficult to read someone else's shorthand. So this is me stretching that out a little bit. But if you were to have a question that like you really, really want to ask, sometimes I would just do like a little exclamation point when I hear someone giving a speech that relates to a contention that I want to talk about, and I would just note it on my paper of, oh, I'm going to ask about this during questioning. Blocks, remember, when you have 5 parts built up on either side, are easy enough to create. Just make sure that you are adding them to like the right, you're lining them up correctly. So if I'm trying to refute someone's second contention, make sure you say, in Representative Blank's second contention, focusing on blank, they talked about blank. I want to refute this point by explaining blah, 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 blah. Don't reference the wrong contention. Don't reference the wrong representative or senator. It's difficult to tell what it is that you're refuting if it's something that you have incorrectly referenced. Research approach. So throughout the legislation, take note of any major strengths or places to poke holes. get a basic understanding of the status quo. So like what's happening in the actual world. Quick tip, Wikipedia can be helpful for getting context quickly, but should never be used as a source. I have heard of it as a source. I personally use it, or used it rather, whenever I would find legislation that I just had no idea what the heck it was on. I would go to Wikipedia, read the page, click a couple links, and then just kind of go down the rabbit hole from there. As you learn more, make sure that you are writing down points for and against the legislation, and then just elaborate them on your researching as you're researching. Write questions and blocks on your prep as they come up to both sides. You don't know what side you're going to be taking until you've really decided. So until that point, having stuff on both sides is good. Also, if you're doing a shared research doc, you should be coming up with stuff on both sides, especially if you're going to be sharing it to someone in your chamber. And then finally, make sure that you're looking for flips, impact strengths, and themes across both sides. A word of caution. There are Discord servers, Facebook groups, Instagram groups, group chats, websites, coaches, companies that promotes the sharing of research, coordinated agenda setting, and pre-round election of POs. This isn't the you should research, says the coach, who then leaves you to figure out research by yourself. This is the coach who sits down and writes the case that every one of their students is going to use. And you can tell very obviously which coaches these are and which students are parts of these schools, because they deliver the same exact speech, word for word, same introduction, same jokes, same punchlines, same sources, same everything. And it's not going to teach you anything. I'm not saying it's not going to make you successful. I am saying that you are not going to learn how to write and present a speech as quickly or effectively as you would if you weren't using someone else's work. Also, on these Discord servers, people who used to compete, who are now judging, have access to what you are saying, what you are preparing, what you are caucusing, who you are promoting, what you are saying about other members. So be careful not to be a bum, because I can see the messages that a lot of people are sending between one another on these congressional debate group chats, and it does reflect on my image of you as a person. I try as hard as I can to base the rankings solely on what I see during the round, but understand that if I know that you knew what the agenda was a week before it happened and you still don't have a sponsorship speech, I'm going to think less of you than if I knew that it was all happening organically in the round and you didn't have a sponsorship speech. So just be aware. Also, all of these like elite little groupie things, leave out those not in the in crowd, often with those with at least experience on any given circuit, which unfortunately a lot of the times happen to be those with at least access to circuit tournaments, whether that is because of cost of hotels or because of exposure to debate or whatever the reason may be. Don't exclude people. Don't be a bum. That's it. All right, group prep, briefs, and sharing of research. So group prep and briefs, a little bit different. Group prep is commonly completed by a competitive team, sometimes with coach involved. There's a difference between being involved to help write a speech and to write everything that's just going to be recycled for every student. Some, especially those sharing a circuit and legislation from week to week, will prep together outside of practices. So I know it's not uncommon for a lot of people on the national circuit to work with one another, come up with agendas, decide who's going to be PO, message people over Facebook, that kind of stuff. Generally don't. If you're going to be prepping with someone, I found it most helpful to prep with one other person. That one other person was at my team and was very similarly motivated. So we were doing national circuit tournaments together pretty much every weekend our senior year from like September through January. And if not national circuit, then whatever one was happening at the local. And if not whatever was happening at the local, then whatever we were finding on Tab Room that was just random and we could join. And I was lucky because the person I was working with was very similarly motivated. We were going to the same tournaments. We had a similar understanding of Congress. And it was a partnership that had grown over a series of years. Not everyone has that. I understand that. And when you find those dockets that have 40 plus pieces of legislation, you have a month to prep it. Group prep is helpful. Just make sure that you are not doing it in a way that disadvantages you. If you are sharing prep in a round that you could be hitting someone that you're in a round with, you definitely want to have the affirmation and negation prepped. You likely don't want to share anything past the stock point. Keep those nuance points for yourself. It sounds mean. Just talk with your team, figure out what the expectation is. Group prep can lead to unfair advantages within a chamber when voting for PO and setting an agenda, especially if the group knows that they're going to have majority walking into a chamber, common on the national circuit. For briefs, they're a little bit different, created by a third party, commonly companies, private coaches, or coaches of school teams. They generally have stock arguments on them, but miss nuances within the debate and can lead to repetitive debate. So if everyone is speaking from the exact same information and the exact same research, there's a little variation in what's going to be brought up throughout the debate. So I don't love the use of briefs, but they can be helpful to get a start for debate. Just make sure that if you're using a brief and you're making a constructive speech, don't have every point be from the brief in the order that they were delivered. It's really easy to tell what's been going on. So be aware of that. Next, it is not in your best interest to share research with someone that you're hoping to beat, especially if they're competing in your chamber. If your coach wants you to share research with your team prior to a tournament, it may be in your best interest to deliver stock arguments and practice and keep the advanced ones separate. If you find that your research team doesn't pull their weight, consider withholding access to group prep until the individual has contributed their share. So on the team that I used to work with at Eastridge, that was the high school I was going to, if there was someone who didn't do their assigned research for 2 weeks in a row, they would be locked out of the research folders until they did that research and for the upcoming tournament. It was harsh. It was effective. We had research for every tournament, and that by my senior year, the person that I was co-captaining with and myself were in charge of a team of 30-ish people. So there were a lot of arguments that were repeated. There were a lot of stock arguments, but it wasn't as much the quality as it was you're getting into the habit of researching and contributing and letting us know when you've done it, you're meeting the deadlines, and you're contributing to learn something that's going to help the team. That was the main idea. My co-captain and I generally created our own document that we would have the points that we would use. And since it was just one other person, we would switch off AF-neg and just prep both sides for everything. And that was a good system. It worked. It was a lot of extra work because not only were we contributing stock points to the main, but also nuanced full speeches to our own with 5 points on the affirmation negation. But it works. Tip, if you prefer to prepare speeches on a legal pad, you can always take a photo and upload it instead of trying to type out all information. Again, just make sure that your handwriting is legible. Again, if you are using shorthand, make sure that it is consistent, and that the people who are reading it have a key or understand it or just know what's going on. Next, bias and sources. So all sources are biased to some degree, but your goal is to try to find sources that are as least biased as possible. This is media bias chart. It's available from Ad Fonte Media, and I honestly could not tell you how they got the information to assign where on the table these sources fall. There are a lot of media bias checkers out there. Check your sources. For example, you might not want to use like Fox and Friends for immigration policy. You might not want to use CNN for immigration policy. Like there are skews one way or the other that can decrease the credibility of a source and your overall presentation as a speaker that you don't necessarily want to do. Government research, peer-reviewed journals, that kind of stuff, generally good. Tabloids, Twitter, Instagram, social media, generally bad. Best practices. Every piece of legislation should be read at a bare minimum before each tournament And when reading through them, come up with a few points on each side that could be elaborated on and built into an extemporaneous speech. So that's like your 5 affirmation, 5 negation. Use relevant sources. So aim for them to be unbiased, recent, and peer reviewed. Don't take research or contentious from someone who could be in your chamber. Then they have a copy of your speech and time to refute your points, or they can deliver your points before you, leaving you without anything going into a round. So careful of it. Try not to let it happen. And the easiest way to not let it happen is to not let anyone have your points. And if you hope to break into elimination rounds, don't bet on others having constructive speeches. There's nothing worse than setting an agenda and then immediately recessing before anyone has spoken because no one has an author or a sponsor. It's embarrassing, especially when you're in an out round that's being recorded and streamed and you're like, you're the best of the best. And then you get to the first bill and it's like, I don't know, I'm not doing anything. That's researching legislation. So we went over approaches to docket research, how to create a research document, one that is padded, gave a couple examples available again in the description of the video, deciding whether to group prep or share research, why you might want to or might not want to, bias in media and why you should always check your sources, and then best practices. Thank you all you lovely people. I hope that you have a good night.